Oh. Okay, so now, since we have a few moments and we don't have enough time to start the next lab will be very short, by the way. It's going to be a lab that we will finally get into HTTP request. We'll look at post request and we'll learn a little bit about asynchronous JavaScript. We'll kind of cut the edge of asynchronous JavaScript, and we'll learn how to make HTTP requests both from HTML using forms and submit buttons, and how to make HTTP requests from JavaScript using the fetch method, and how we can go ahead and use async await or the then method to go ahead and order asynchronous functions. So we'll talk a little bit about that next lab. You could say it's only like 5 goals. It's going to be very short. So it shouldn't take our full lab hour to be able to complete this, which is, that should be good. I was hoping to be able to pack it into today, but that's fine. I could do, we could talk about the final project actually, because we're getting to be at the mid-semester point. And so it's pretty important that we start thinking about what we want to do for the final project. So I want to highlight over here, since we have some time, since we have about 20 minutes or so, or maybe a little bit more than that, 25 minutes or so, to go ahead and to be able to focus in on this. So let's go to inside of Moodle, our projects. So first I'll click on this, and then I'll click on this. So the first thing we should do is I want everyone to start looking at the, that's not what I want. Oh, that's a PNG. It doesn't display the PNGs like it once did. It just links to them. Oh, I need to update these dates. Those dates are wrong. Those are from some other time. So I'm glad that that's not there. Okay, let's go to here. Yeah, I updated them here. So, and let's update them here. Okay, so these are rough approximations about probably where you want to be at. And I might do a reconsideration of these sometime in the future as well. But your final project, so that it's not super scary and that everything is like dependent on what you produce at the outgo of everything, is actually broken down into iterative stages. That way you kind of know what your grade is for your final project as you're stepping along it. And a final project should be, in my opinion, it should be about you should be evaluated a lot on the planning as much as what you actually deliver on as well, just like you would be in the real world. And so we can think of 9 discrete stages that you can think of your grade as coming from. And then it's all broken down here, where 5% of the final grade of the final project grade of the project grade is on your project proposal. And then 10% would be on a planning and specification document. And then 10% would be on a front end design document. And then 10% would be based off of a back end design document. And then 10% would be based off of your data design document. And then, so this will get you 10, 20, 30, 45% of your grade just comes from building out all your documentation. And then while you're actually developing your code base, just to ensure that you and your team are working on getting things complete, sometime throughout, you can schedule audits with me to show off and do a walkthrough of some of your test implementations of the client layer, and some of your test implementations of the server layer, and some of your test implementations on your data layer. And so the reason why I have these project audits set up for the final is that when we get to the final project demo, you can be ensured that you're on a pathway to success. Because for the final project, what we're going to do for the scheduled exam period is everyone is going to do a demo of their final projects for the class. So, and it'll be very similar to the video I shared on the very first day of lecture. As you might recall, I shared a link from last year's collection of demos that all the teams had done. And we're going to do something just like that with this year as well. And I think last year I had invited Dr. Samuel. I'll invite him this year, but I'll also go ahead and invite some other some people either in industry or some alumni as well, and try to get more interaction and more feedback so that you can really get, again, the idea is for these projects to be portfolio ready, and this is supposed to be your crowning jewel. So I'll try to go ahead and get as many other people who can give insightful feedback after your demonstration. So the entire point of all this other prep work is to make sure that you'll be in a good place so you can actually present your final to the rest of the class. And it'll be in a very similar format as the way that the audits work. You get to do a guided demonstration where you walk through and explain all the feature sets of your code. So just a little bit of pre-warning right there. But again, if you want a good notion of how this will materialize, I encourage everyone to go back and look at last year's demo, which I would also suggest if I'm showing you last year's set of demos, you should also have the expectation that next year we'll also be looking at your set of demos as example cases. So please keep that in mind as well, that these demos are eternal. They'll be collected together and shared with the future sets of classes that come after you. And you can leave a legacy of what your applications are. Excellent. So with that said, now, does anyone have any questions in terms of the final project? So the final project has to be a full stack application. So far, we have really just taken a deep dive into the front end. And so, and with again, the expectation that there was no knowledge of HTML or CSS or JavaScript. So we really took a long time building a strong foundation on how the browser goes ahead and displays what appears in the viewport and how you can programmatically update that. And we're about to see how we can then request data from a backend service, like a server, to go ahead and get information to then update our view inside of our viewport. Again, that concept is what drives what is an SPA, a single page application. After these next few labs that we have, so we have a lab on HTML contact forms, we have a lab that we're going to do a quiz game on, and I think that that's the contact form and the quiz game. I think after that, and I'll double check, I think we move on to the back end. And that's super important because we need to start looking at backend stuff. Let me go up here. Let's take a look at our labs. So Bootstrap, object dumps. Yeah, we have the contact form. And yeah, and then we have the quiz game, and then which is going to be a RESTful client. Then we're going to move to installing Node, and then we're going to do a lab that's going to focus on Node and NPM. And then we'll look at Express to build out a web server. Then we'll talk a little bit about designing our own REST API, which will be the high-low game, a multiplayer version of high-low game where we'll build a back end, and then we will build a front end that uses the back end. Then we'll start talking about different responsibilities that your server will have to have, like authentication, data persistence, which is going to be Mongo, but you're free to use whatever tooling you want. I'm not restricting you to any tooling in this class. It's just, it would make sense to use the tooling we cover in the labs and the lectures. But if you want to use Postgres, if you want to use Oracle SQL or MySQL, you're free to use whatever database you want. And then we'll do other peripheral things on top of that. So yeah, we're starting to move into the back end very soon, which is super critical because that's what we're going to need to know for the back end of our project. So the front end has to do with the part that is interfaces with the client, but presumably your application, whatever your final project is going to have to manage data on a server side too. And so there's a lot of data that you want to manage on the server side, not the client side in a web application. For instance, anything that's supposed to be shared between multiple users, or anything that's supposed to be private, or if you want to store something so it can be accessible based off of the username and password. So think of almost every kind of web application that you can think of that uses username and password. All of that is being stored on the server side, and then your front end, the part that, say, for instance, that we have been building, might send a request, a login request to a backend server with the username and password. And then the server would then give whatever data the client side would need to be able to do whatever its job is. So let's say it's a video game. Well, you might have a login credential for the user, and then the server would go look up the player data for that user and return that to the client so that the client can start playing where they last left off. That would be a good example of a server-side responsibility and a client-side responsibility. Let's say we want to make it even a little bit more complex. Let's say you want to make a game that could have multiple players playing simultaneously. You might want to use WebSockets for that, but then the server is also the thing that's going to control where all the players are in relation to one another. And so if you want to make a multiplayer game, it makes sense. You need a server for that as well. And again, the database will be all the data that the server has to store and maintain over. So when you start thinking about your project, make sure that you can kind of distinguish, well, what would be the responsibilities of my front end? What would be the responsibilities that some backend server will have to have? And you'll kind of see what that looks like with the next lab when we start making requests, even for our contact form. Like, think about our contact form for your portfolio page. You probably have that, most of you have it, but it doesn't link to anything. It's just a field that has like a name, an email, and a message. But if you want to store that somewhere, you can't do it from the client side. It has to go to some remote server for that to do something. And so for the first lab, we're not going to worry about, we're going to abstract away the idea of working on these servers on our own. We're going to use pre-existing services, but eventually we're going to pivot so that we design our own backend service. And you're going to have to design your own backend service for your final project. And then the data design is just like effectively the models, the data that you have to store, and the scheme of the data that you have to store on the server side that then might have to be delivered to the client side. In terms of the way that these documents might be laid out, when you go to decide, well, how might my front end design document look? Well, like, consider using my labs as examples and the way that I showed you how to build out these projects. So when I had a lab that shows you, these are like the mock-ups of what this application is going to look like, that's a good example of what a front end design document will look like. And it'll be the same thing with a back end. And if you have any questions though, you can actually go each of the portions of the final project. It has its own PDF file. Let me find where that is. So here, for instance, if you wanted to know, oh, what is this client design when I need to, or let's do specifications. Let's do this. This will be the first, or even proposal. Did I already do that though? Let me see. Yeah, part one. So yeah, so each one of these has a PDF that kind of lets you know everything you would need to do. So this is the breakdown. You have the project proposal. Inside the project proposal, you effectively are going to declare your team members, propose an idea, and include like an abstract. So a general idea about what your web application does, like what problem is it trying to solve, why, like what the motivation behind the application is. Then after your project proposal, you can start going into the planning and specification document. Here you can identify all the user stories. A user story is just a fancy way of describing from the user's perspective how they engage and the flow of engagement that occurs while using your app. So say, for instance, if I'm a new user, I might go to a landing page that might have login or register. So a new user would hit the register button, which would bring me to a registration page. And then I would register, and then that would bring me to my account page, right? So think of the step by step that might occur from this perspective of a new user, and then relate that to, say, for instance, a pre-existing user. They would instead click on the login page, and that would bring them to the landing page. And say, suppose correlate that to an admin. So let's say that this application has an async, not asynchronous, what's the word I'm looking for? It's symmetrical. It's an asymmetrical set of responsibilities. So general users might have one view, but maybe administrators have a different view. So suppose, for instance, as an example, this was an application that managed providing grades to students. Then you'd have different user profiles. One user profile for one user story would be how the student logs in and gets their information, where another user story would be how the teacher or instructor logs in to go ahead and assign grades or deliver quizzes or things like that. So again, you would identify all the various users of your application and the way they navigate through, and detail the features that each one of those users would access, and then try to make decisions whether that feature would be something that you would think belong on the back end, or whether it would be able to be done on the front end, or whether it's some kind of data that has to be maintained and stored. So you kind of start to understand how to break your features down into where the responsibility would get implemented. And again, by no means think of these as living documents. So it gives you a guide, but this is just a guide. You don't have to hamstring yourself. So as you continually develop and you decide that your initial inclination wasn't good, well, we're adhering to agile principles. So you at any time have flexibility to break what you stated in a previous document to update it, because maybe you've learned better in the process of your development. Okay, after the planning and specification document, you're going to have your front end design document. The front end design document is going to be made up of actual mock-ups. So whereas these are just kind of generally abstract ideas of like, it's essentially giving me a collection of elevator pitches, the front end document will actually start creating mock-ups of what all the front end pages will look like and what interactions have to happen between the user and the front end system, and what kind of controllers you might have set up in your front end, and what controllers might have to then, what kind of requests it might make to the back end, what kind of views you would have, and the tooling you plan to use. And the tooling would be like what pre-existing technologies, whether it's HTML or CSS or Bootstrap or React or anything else that you might find. So let's say you're building a game, you might want to use Phaser.js. If it's a 2D game, let's say that you want to use something related to 3D, then other tooling might be like Three.js or WebGL or anything else. So also include what you expect to be able to use in terms of how you intend to implement everything out. And then the backend design document would be not dissimilar. You talk about what backend services you intend to go ahead and implement, like what your backend will be responsible for, what routes or URLs will you be listening to on your REST API, so that routes and endpoints would be kind of tethered together. We're going to learn more about that in the coming lectures. You'd have what HTTP methods will you support, and then you would essentially propose an API, the same thing as any other kind of API, which would be like a series of function calls that web clients like browsers can make to your web server that you would then deliver data on. And then here for your backend design document, you can also list what kind of tooling you intend to use, whether it's going to be Node or Express or Passport. Like we'll go into like authentication tooling and whatnot in future labs. So you can start kind of making considerations of how you intend to build things out. And if you have pre-existing knowledge, you feel free to use tooling you're already familiar with. For our data design document, this is really going to talk about your database schema for each user story model. So again, the user story models, let's go back to that idea of, let's say you're building some kind of like Moodle replacement. Then you would probably have a schema that represents a student, a schema that would represent a teacher or instructor, a schema that would go ahead and represent other things like maybe usernames and hash passwords or other data, any data that has to get archived. You have to figure out how you're going to persist that. And then that's it. That's the design documents. Based off of this, you should be able to start implementing out. And while you're working on it, feel free to go ahead and whenever you feel comfortable, start requesting audits with me so that you can, make sure that you get everything in a functional order so that it can be assembled so that you'll be ready for a demo on the final day for the exam time on the final day of class effectively. Let's see, is it a good idea to have meetings, audits with you along the way? Yeah, so feel free at any time. So the audits don't just have to be related to showing off what you've already completed. If you're having difficulties with an assignment, if you need help debugging at any time, you can schedule an audit with me and I'll give you my feedback on or assistance in debugging whatever problem you're having. So please reach out to me if you're running into issues and I'll try to help you as best as I can based off of my availability. So yeah, I think it's a good idea just to touch base with me so that you're not struggling the last couple of days before demo trying to build a full stack application, because that will just wreck your day. That is not the way that you want to plan out having to build into this project. So now what I would request everyone to do is go through and start making plans to do your project proposal. I think we're probably around the time in the semester where everyone should start doing this, where you start. So here, you're going to propose an idea for a full stack application. This application must include front end, back end, and database operations. Additionally, I want everyone to post a blog article announcing your full stack project, right? Because we talked about how the blog articles would be the use case for the blog article would be a good use case as a dev diary. And so to receive full credit for your proposal, you need to have these 4 things. You will propose an idea. So that's going to provide a complete and developed idea for a full stack application. Your proposed idea should be practical and applicable. Consider creating a service you would want to use yourself. Okay, the other thing you should consider is write an abstract. So write an abstract detailing your idea. An abstract should provide some short background information about the problem your app solves, determine the target audience for your app, define basic features of the app, and explain the front end, back end, and database requirements. Don't spend too much time with this. This is really what the other design documents are, or the next document is really more about this. This is just where this could be like a sentence or 2. Like the next document is where you will stretch this out to be the full document for your specification document. The next thing I want you to do is to get comfortable every time you're working on a new project to post a little bit about the project, because this gives it context. This will make the project more meaningful in your portfolio if you give information related to it. And like here, effectively, this blog article could be this project proposal as an HTML document, right? It could have your idea and your team members and the abstract of what you're trying to solve. So here it would just be an article that includes all the information defined in your proposal. The blog article should have a heading as your project announcement. The article should also include your project's abstract, some background information as why you selected to make this app, and proposed features for your app. And if you're working in a team, announce the team you're working with, along with images of your team members and a quick bio for them. And then finally, also, clearly, you would declare your team here. So this is where you will start to group into team. Feel free to use Discord with the find a team channel or whatnot to start seeking out team members. And, I'll leave it to you to self-group into teams and to decide how you're going to select the criteria for team membership. But I mean, everyone has homeworks. Everyone's been able to see everyone else's demo. So you kind of get a chance to interview each other to decide if you want to be team members with other people. So you get to be in some ways both an interviewee and an interviewer, since you're going to have to provide a deliverable alongside each other. So you may decide whether to work either individually or in a team. If you opt to work as a team, your proposal must include your team members. And obviously, team members may turn in the same proposal, but must have their own individual blog articles posted. Now, even though you're going to turn in the same proposal, I need everyone to turn in the proposals individually on Moodle so I can assign a grade. And so my next thing is I need to update the grade ledger to include the quizzes, and then I'll actually start taking all the grades that I have for the homeworks from our audits. I'll start publishing those into Moodle pretty soon. So that'll happen soon, I promise. But if you pass I will say if you pass through the audits at this point, you can expect that you got full marks for your audit grade. Okay, and then this just gives you your submission information. Here you just submit the proposal into Moodle, just like you did submit everything else. And then you would publish your blog article onto your portfolio page. And then whenever we do the audit at the very end, I'll go ahead and look for those article posts. Or what I would like to do is have a URL inside the proposal, or anytime you do a blog article, and give me that information there so I can do a quick check with a hyperlink. Excellent. Is there any questions related to this? Does everyone feel kind of comfortable starting to think about and consider working on this final project?
Yes, it sounds really good. One question, it says that the proposal is due around week 6. Do you have like a specific day? Should it be like by the end of next week or by the end of this week, something like this?
I think that's a good, I think a week for a proposal is probably a good time. So yeah, let's do a week from, I guess today. Let's do a week from today as our deadline for proposal, because that gives everyone a good long time to think about it. And between now and then, we'll have started to work with some back-end services to give you a firmer idea of what that looks like. But I would implore everyone between now and then to start watching some of my videos on back-end services to get a good idea of what that might look like, or to go and look at last year's collection of demos to see what those projects look like. Excellent, good question. But the one video I would probably suggest everyone look at between now and then would be, let me get to Moodle. Week would be, async, new, HT, where is it? It would be lecture express node basics right here, this one. It would be under week 9, lecture 16. I think this would be a good one because it has back-end overview. So it would give you a quick crash course in everything that effectively we count as the back end. And you know what? There's also a set of PowerPoints that you could just kind of look through, and they're very quick PowerPoints. It's not very long. Where is it? Lecture, browser data structures, events, async, modules. Here, backend overview. It's lecture 14 as the PDF. It's just 2 pages. So here, you can just look at this itemized list. If there's anything that doesn't make sense to you there, it might be worth just doing a quick Google search so you can understand. But effectively, you're going to be a backend listens for HTTP requests and sends responses. And you'll want to set up REST endpoints and authentication and things like that. So I guess maybe the lecture might give more insights as to what each of these are, but this gives a good understanding of what the second half of lectures for backend services and technologies will cover over. Excellent. Is there any other questions? Well, everyone have a great day. I will go ahead and stop the recording.